Welcome to Modern Mythology, a podcast that explores the many intersections of story and system. For more information about this episode, articles, or links to our other related projects, visit modernmythology.net.
I actually, in my real life, I separate the way that I approach my life into two aspects of the science fiction genre. On the one hand, at times I am Star Trek Sean, and the other hand, I am Star Wars Sean. I tend to be Star Trek at work, where I'm very technical and very by the book, and actually very principled in the way that I approach everything that I do there. And then when I come home, you turn
into a Wookiee.
Then, yeah, exactly. All the weird aliens come out and show their face. But then the space opera aspect of Star Wars and the freewheeling and the fun of it is something that I try and bring to my kids and just the home life. So I just thought I'd point that out because we got to experience a little bit of each of those, in the different systems that we, were able to play as we did the sci-fi genre. So I think we did a couple things that definitely touched on the space opera theme that made me feel like we were, recalling Star Wars. But at the same time,
I would argue that Star Wars is space Western.
There's Mandalorian definitely is, that's for sure.
Well, I mean, if you really think about even the original Star Wars has a lot of Western
or space samurai,
right? Well, and samurai films, which were also tied with cowboy films,
tied to Westerns, exactly.
Yeah. But I think of Firefly as being the epitome of the space West.
That's over the top space Western, right? But I mean, it's specifically trying to be a Western, right? Where they were sort of filing off the serial numbers for Star Wars, and even to the point where Han has a very stereotypical Western look, so it was definitely a mashup.
You could definitely wear chaps.
Yeah. That's funny. I love that. I love that I mean, those are the two most common and the most popular science fiction franchises, right? And most recognizable things. I'm sure at some point in time fights have broken out between the fans of the two groups, idea.
Many times. That's a archetypical
trope, right?
conflict. Yeah. And people get so kind of hung up on taxonomy of subgenres, and no, this is that subgenre and this one, kind of thing too. It becomes very territorial. It's kind of funny.
Yeah, and I wanted to. We were sort of starting this conversation off by my hypothesis, which was, I think science fiction wants to genre analysis in science fiction, I think, is a little less fluid. It's fluid. I'm not going to say that there's not a lot of conversation there, but I feel I don't know if it's easier or if it's more important, or I'm not certain where that lies, but I feel it's more distinct. Genres, for instance, my most recent thought process there was when we played Otherscape. Otherscape is a superhero game, and it's set in cyberpunk, and we really tried to push as much of the cyberpunk as we could, but it didn't feel like cyberpunk. The system,
like I said, it doesn't feel gritty.
It doesn't feel gritty enough. It doesn't feel dystopian enough. There is this sense that noise, Sean, is technology in Otherscape. And the idea that people are so numbed to the noise that they start believing in myth again. That has an interesting dystopian, sort of
The ghost
to
in the
it.
machine, right? I mean,
Sure.
just to think
Yeah.
about is there a soul there, right? Yeah,
Definitely. Yeah,
definitely. I love that.
the setting is pretty awesome, and there's a lot about it to recommend it. It's just that the system in a weird way doesn't engage that way.
Yeah, it doesn't. It's where we converted our characters over to Runners in the Shadows, which is almost a complete Blades in the Dark port. And I've been feeling like it's much grittier. It's
It
much
feels more
down to
cyberpunk.
earth.
Yeah, we're trying to kind of like rushing to get our characters a little bit of experience so we kind of feel a little bit like our old characters in some ways, but it definitely just the system itself has that feeling.
Yeah. Cool. So let's talk about genre. So first off, what do you guys think? Do you feel like I feel like science fiction genres are more important than analysis of like fantasy genres. I feel like fantasy, you could be like sword and sorcery, high fantasy. Well, you know.
I liked what you guys did with horror, and I also think horror's got some pretty distinct genres that that make that something that you could recognize. But I definitely agree with you on fantasy. That can blur even throughout the same campaign, right? Like you can get into all kinds of different fantasy genres depending on how you go. Even steampunk, introduce gnomes and then you got steampunk, but I think you're right. I think with these genres, it set the stage for everything that was in the background. You know what I mean? Like the stuff that wasn't talked about, you could visualize because we set the campaign or the session in the cyberpunk genre, and had conversations about that.
My counterpoint would be that there's definitely exceptions to this, but a lot of sci-fi basically uses technology to do the same sort of thing in the world that magic does in fantasy. And so there's the whole thing of Star Wars is just like space wizards, and that's reductive in a way. It's not just that, but there's something to it also, and I found this running fantasy campaigns and running sci-fi games. A lot of times in my head, it's like, okay, what's the communications technology? Message spell, or whatever the analog is, across, from technology to magic. Or
only the space wizards can wield the magic weapons, right? The magic swords,
right? So it's kind of and then there becomes a lot of those subgenres become a question of sort of how you engage with that, and of course, hard sci-fi tries to kind of peg it down to being much more realistic in that way. So I feel like there's a much more distinct delineation there, whereas the other ones, it's more kind of it's still fairly aesthetic in terms of cyberpunk and dystopian, for instance, right? They're kind of overlapping. It's kind of more about a feel thing and maybe a question of what the level of technology is, but then not always, right?
And I do feel like cyberpunk begins to not feel like cyberpunk when you're not in this desperate battle with the powers that be, when things are too clean and once you really stop struggling with the setting, then I feel like it stops being cyberpunk.
Yeah. The struggle can become more internal, but then you're kind of getting more into tech noir, if you want to get technical about it, where it's still that sort of it's kind of how I think of The Expanse a little bit more. For a while, I was like, there's something cyberpunk-y about The Expanse, but it's not cyberpunk. And I was like, I think it's kind of, if you want to get on those taxonomies, I think it's tech noir in that way, where it has that feel, it makes sense for one of the characters to wear a detective hat and, kind of be the detective because it just fits in.
Yeah. And thinking about fantasy subgenres, right? First off, we were looking at Wikipedia and the science fiction genres and the fantasy genres. I found it very interesting that steampunk was in both.
Yeah.
And
it is kind of a grab bag of both.
It's interesting because I feel like science fiction genres tend to be more tropey or tend to define the setting a little bit more than, say, fantasy subgenres. I think once you get to certain fantasy subgenres like Arthurian or historical fantasy, then sure, you're like we're pretty set into a particular place and time, and we see here gaslamp fantasy, like, or Victorian fantasy, right? Where like it's very clear what the clothing is going to look like. It's very clear what the what kind of technology we're using, but like the difference between dark fantasy and low fantasy and sword and sorcery, I feel like a lot of times that's really gonna.
Yeah. I'm sure there are people who those are fighting words too, but I tend to agree with you.
I'm sure. I can see like there are some nuances, but I feel like when you start to bleed some of the fantasy subgenres, they bleed more easily than science fiction subgenres. A good example is like you could have a good romance story. You could, with maybe some exceptions, you could throw in romance fantasy. You could throw in some of these ideas. You can, paranormal. You can obviously steampunk, right? Like D&D has already incorporated, which is obviously high fantasy, already incorporated a lot of steampunky elements, with the artificer and such. And I feel like they're easier to do in fantasy without breaking the tropes. As compared to science fiction, I think you really start to veer.
I think it depends on which kind of trope you're going for, like, again, hard sci-fi, definitely. But I mean, you see, we've been talking a lot about the crossover between cyberpunk and with aliens, with, Blade Runner and aliens and that sort of thing. And if you can, I think like a lot of cases where there's overlap, it's usually you have to have a through line to it. It's not usually like thrown together, like the Alien Earth as an example recently, like is trying to add more of the cyberpunk elements, more of the the transhumanist as technology part, although it exists in the original stuff, obviously. But that's kind of what they're focusing in on, and it's like a reason for doing it, as opposed to like, I mean, my kind of knee-jerk response to steampunk a lot of times is that it feels like everything in the kitchen sink without a reason. It's just kind of, that's the thing, so you put them all together because that's the thing, and like that doesn't work, I don't think, as well for most sci-fi. But if you have a reason for doing it, I mean, that's always the.
But you're right. The aliens got a more of a throughput from bouncing back and forth in time. You get to see the development of the different human subtypes, and then the development of the understanding of the xenomorphs and the aliens, things like that.
Well, and it also like hops genres, but doesn't. So in like understanding that Blade Runner is earlier in Earth's evolution, whatever you want to call it, development, and it's the same thing with like going from, say, anima in Trinity Continuum, like Aberrant to Anima, and Anima's their cyberpunk setting, but then it goes into Aeon, right? Mm-hmm. Where now you're getting into much more sci-fi. And I've been sort of very careful to not tread too heavily into one or the other, right? Like, I want to make certain that hope and sacrifice, and I forget what the third theme was, unity. That's what hope, sacrifice, and unity are part and parcel to the themes in Aeon. And that it's not too dark, and that you're not fighting against the directive, which is your bosses. Like, they're not bad guys, That was like the big difference between, say, us playing free market and another game.
I thought we were supposed to do that in free market. We just broke it.
Right. Because we were immediately, screw these guys. Right. We're getting out of here.
But there's paranoia, and then there's free market. And I think it was necessary for them in free market to say, the aggregate is not the bad guy. The aggregate is not trying to hurt you. The aggregate's just trying to run a well-oiled machine.
Fuck the aggregate.
And paranoia is like, no, the computer's the bad guy, and by the way, controls everything, kind of idea. So, by the way, it's, thinking about in terms of Blade Runner to Alien, there was a Rutger Hauer film called Split Second, which is one of those films that is like so bad it's good. Like it's the weapon the alien had was that Split Second? Yes, there was a hunter, an alien hunter. So it was like a xenomorph, and then a guy who comes down to like hunt the xenomorphs. Is that the movie I'm thinking of? And he's like shoots CDs. That was like his weapon, if I remember correctly. But anyway, but I thought Split Second was actually pretty good.
I watched it when I was a kid, and I do not remember it at all, but I do remember it existing.
1992.
Yeah.
I don't want to go too much into fantasy genres because we're gonna like go. Our next season is about fantasy games.
Sure.
But
Scott, can I talk about one thing? Just bridging the fantasy. This is my perspective to having only played high fantasy D&D or D&D
Right.
and all of its fantasy iterations, and then coming into playing the science fiction. It really threw me off when we started incorporating the magic in science fiction. Like cyberpunk, I can get sci-fi, again, sort of relating back to the more accessible tropes or whatever. But as soon as we started doing, I think in with Rafi, that your character was really
right. Echoes the Veil. Yeah.
Had all kinds of really just sorcery powers. And any time that it was even hinted at, it kind of threw me off a little bit because I'm like, oh wait, with magic and sci-fi, like how's this gonna get incorporated into it? And if you layer that on top of the technology, it's like, well, how do those two things interact? Like,
guessing you never played Shadowrun.
well, and it's funny because we joke that Star Wars is called Space Wizards, right? Like,
right.
If the Force isn't magic, I don't know what is.
It's midichlorians in your blood, or
my God, yes,
yeah,
midichlorians.
Yeah, we don't have to go into that.
I think that's one of the things. So Jamie and I have been talking about the upcoming Trinity campaign, and the idea of like, how do you come up with something like, so Mage did this really interesting thing where they had the dichotomy between traditional mages and the technocracy. And the philosophical difference between the two was merely a matter of approach, was merely a matter of like, the technocracy is going to do things in a way that people expect that they can happen using technology, right? But like the reality is most of us don't know how our remote control works. We know we have to kind of point it at the TV and push buttons, but we don't know how those buttons work. We don't know how those buttons interact with the internal circuitry. And most of us don't know how that interacts with the television and why we can point it away and it works.
I actually fear that we're going to lose that knowledge as a human race. Like, that's going to be generational, and at some point we're going to have to re-engineer some of this stuff. Because
so much of it is digital that it's very easy to lose digital records, and then for it just to be
And I learned something just this year, right? I did not know, and I'm going to date myself, back in the day, remote controls were 4 buttons. There were 4 big clicky buttons, right? And it was like a device, probably about the size of an index card, and you would click them and it would change the channels. I only learned recently that was actually a sonic device. That when you clicked it, it made a particular sound that the television picked up. And and because you had to press them, they were totally analog. There was nothing digital about that fucking thing. And you pressed it. I did not know that certain sounds meant channel up and certain sounds meant channel down, and and so on and so forth. I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. Most people do not know that, right?
Yeah.
And so that was like the technocracy's difference between people who were drawing circles in the ground and moving their hands around and saying crazy words. People of the time cannot relate to that type of magic, right? And so we were really thinking about, how do we ground magic? Like, how do we have these high-end science fiction-y ideas and have it feel like science fiction, and make that leap?
Yeah.
Right?
We don't have to get into the character there, but I do think it's interesting that, like, it's easy to figure certain, like, cybernetics, for instance, like, allow you to do things that seem magical, but there's other things it doesn't make sense for at all. Like telepathy, for instance. Okay, that's pretty easy to figure. Like, it's not magical. You can just have that be like, pinging something in your head or whatever, like a chip.
Yeah.
There's other magical effects that are.
You can say that about a lot of science fiction tropes too. I mean, just the interface of the technology itself to, biological organism, like the fact that you can download your memories, like that is total science fiction. That's totally fabrication. The other thing, I think we talked about this a little bit, is like, if you go faster than the speed of light, like any kind of warp drive, any kind of traveling through space,
right, sure.
Like it's the same thing as waving a magic wand, right? It's a you might as well say it's Harry Potter saying you're going to the next star system, But we use it in the terms of of science fiction because it makes sense there.
That we get the sense of, like, certain tropes like faster than light travel. We like say, okay, there's a way you can do that where you create a warp bubble. Okay, there's a way you can do that where you create, a wormhole. And then those things become like, those tropes become like kind of like givens, where you're just like, oh yeah, it's a wormhole, right? And then you kind of are able to adapt, like, kind of utilize that within a setting.
It crosses over the settings too. Yeah. Because then you can just use it to explain that trope. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of times how, at least when I run sci-fi, it tends to be how I kind of think about it. Is almost more like, what tropes am I pulling in?
Right. And so many of those tropes were developed to be able to tell stories easier, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, if you want a story about the effects of some guy going to another planet and coming home and having been changed, him being 100 years older is not going to tell a good story, right? Which is what should happen.
Or it becomes a big factor that it takes over the whole story. You know what I mean? Like Interstellar, and even aspects of Alien with Sigourney Weaver, in terms of, like, the fact that, they had traveled for so long. But, like, Interstellar is a good example. Is like, they try to be as realistic as they can about, relativity, and, and traveling through time until it gets to the black hole. But then getting home and, his daughter's older than him. You know what I mean? Like that's a real thing. But how do you incorporate that into a story without it taking over the story? You know what I mean? Like you wouldn't be able to.
And that's kind of what I was getting at before. Is like, unless you want it to become the story, right? Like, unless if that's what the story is, then you want to keep that restriction in place. In art, with RPG specifically, it's kind of like, a lot of times in the first couple of sessions with a sci-fi game, if it's not something that's like already easily defined between everyone, a lot of it I feel is, at least as a player especially, I do a lot of sort of like kind of not flailing about is maybe a little bit too dramatic, but like, just kind of figuring out like what within that setting, which tropes, which like things are like a given, which things aren't, like, and kind of like what the reality of that thing is, however different that reality is,
It feels like flailing about. I mean, in the context of our game, when we start off and I don't know, I've never heard the setting before, I don't know anything about it, you say, it's in a Middle Eastern space opera. I'm like, whoa, I've got no, very little reference to start there. And then we get into the setting and I start to learn more about it. But I certainly feel a little challenged to say, okay, how do I move about in this new setting? What is permissible and what's not? But once you get the feel of it, once you get in that zone and you get comfortable with it, it's it's a lot of fun.
And it's talking about technology. If you think about it, like how you approach technology, I think affects how science fiction feels. Where
Yes.
I feel like that does different things in fantasy. I feel like you can add elements of technology to fantasy without breaking the fantasy, where I feel like science fiction is a little more fragile. I feel like you could add guns to fantasy. You can add technology, like you said, gnomes and goblins. You add technological devices, and by and large it still feels fantastic, but it
As
but
long as it
it's
doesn't break the system, that's that. Some systems aren't designed for
Well,
it.
I mean,
Really, but
imagine adding a goblin to one of our science fiction campaigns. Like, it's not impossible,
right.
but like,
No.
it would be like, okay, wait a minute. Now
why
you
is
gotta
he?
really
Why is he
explain where
there?
this goblin came from. Like,
Right.
yeah, what is
Exactly.
this?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and we're going to see with Daggerheart. So Daggerheart is meant to be a multi-genre system, and it leans into fantasy pretty heavily, but it does have a couple different genres. It has a Western genre framework in there. It has a science fiction sort of cyberpunky genre framework in there. And it really is like one of the ways that I sort of saw like some of the veil started to come away from my eyes is when I really thought about genre and how to approach genre in RPGs with like zombies, right? And then I was thinking of like Space Hulks, and I was thinking, holy shit, like you could run an entire campaign on this multi-generational ship that is just could to the players just be a very complex cave network. You know what I mean? And like,
Sure.
you wouldn't really know, and it's like, that would have been interesting, spoiler alert, if anybody hasn't watched The Village, when she like pops out of the village, like how crazy would that have been if she saw fucking space?
Yeah.
There's a Star Trek movie plot where they try to create this transport ship where they transport a culture from one place to another without them knowing, by like using a holodeck and stuff in the ship, and so they don't know they're being transferred. And I guess you could do that like where you have a set up where you like think you're in a fantasy world or whatever, or you're like in this traditional world of your ancestors, whatever, and then suddenly the holodeck malfunctions. Really mess with your player's head.
That's happened to me. That's happened to me in real life several times.
Wait, which quite honestly, that's what Mind the Gap is to a certain degree, right? Like, I've played with that a number of times with Cyberpunk. Is the idea that you're in the network, you're in the net or the matrix or whatever the fuck you want to call it, and that's
that was great. It was still my favorite. Just coming to that realization, that whole thing, and then again, and then speaking of the magic, and I know we talked about this before, but it's my favorite moment is in Mind the Gap when I'm getting really frustrated with not knowing what's going on as a character and as a player, not hitting on anything, and then there's a glitch that has you go from one end of the train to the other end of the train, and just think about magic, but it's a glitch, right? That you sort of explain it, and then suddenly I have this eureka moment of like, oh wait a minute, the glitch puts me behind the enemy. And if I go through it, and now I'm right there. So it was just like,
if memory serves, you also got a crit on it too. So it was a really dramatic, like
like is that what happened? I thought it was.
I'm pretty sure.
I thought
it was the idea too. I mean, being behind him certainly helped.
So awesome.
Well, let's get into some of the games we did, and then we'll, I'm sure some genre things will probably pop up in that conversation, right? But we're already talking about Mind the Gap, so so let's see. The first one that we did, actually, I won't know in chronological order, but we did Cyberpunk. We did Mind the Gap, which was the one we were just talking about.
It wasn't Coriolis the actual first one we did though. I think.
Yeah, I think that's why I was thrown off, because the list that we have up is different from the chronological.
Who knows what's going to be published? But yeah. I think in real life, for me, and again, that was like my first sort of foray into another realm of RPG. You know what I mean? So and again, and I don't know, if it's just because of that novelty, but I that still holds a really dear place in my heart because of it. Like I look at the games that we played over the past several weeks and months, and like Coriolis to me is still like really fantastic. Yeah,
you seem to really enjoy that one. I got that sense.
I love Coriolis. And Jamie, didn't you find recently that they republished it?
Yeah, I tagged you on that, Sean. They released it. It looks like I didn't look too closely. I didn't try to order it yet, but because it was not really easily available for a little bit. So
let's get that right, because
I know you tagged me, and then I went back to find it. I couldn't find it.
Because I do know they have a second edition. It's not really a second edition. It's sort of like a extension. We talked about that before, but core game editions. Here we go. Latest releases. So the Great Dark is the new one, which I really want to play. The Great Dark at some point in time. I want to read it. But then you have old school Coriolis. It doesn't look up. Here we go. Yeah, so this is the new one, which is the Great Dark. I don't know how much they changed it, but
it looks gorgeous.
It looks gorgeous, but it's about 50 years, 50 or 500. I think it's 50 years in the future, or something to that effect. So that's what's going on with that. So that was Coriolis. Yeah. Next was Mothership, which, I mean, the session that we played was not very like aliens, but my sense of the system, kind of like it works very well in Bug Hunt. Obviously, it works very well for that style of game, even though it's not, alien exactly. Mothership has this thing where it leans into these genres. It says, look, we're going to be a space horror game, but what is your setting going to be? Bug Hunt is sort of feels like a natural extension to the science fiction, horror science fiction, but it's a whole slew of things, and they ran a month of like 30 different, I think, publishers created Mothership content, as well as what they were kickstarting.
I know it was a lot. I didn't know it was that many.
Yeah, I think it was 30. And then because it's setting agnostic, we layered the Coriolis setting over Mothership. So I just used the same tropes and the same narrative, but really we're just using a different system. Right.
I'm glad you explained that, because at the time it went over my head a little bit. I was trying to figure out, okay, what is the relationship here between Mothership and Coriolis, and I understand that we're playing two different systems, so that was
right. And that's a kind of a fun idea, because then you get to see, like, all right, taking setting out of the variable, now how do these two systems tell different kinds of stories?
Yeah, that's has the fear die, right?
Yes.
Isn't that part of it? Yeah. I thought that the mechanic worked pretty well. And I found what is it called in Coriolis?
Dark points.
Dark points, right? 'Cause it's kind of a little different, but similar kind of concept, where you have this sort of building, kind of thing that this GM can use against you.
Right.
Is that similar to the Alien game setting? And not that I know this, but I'm just.
So Coriolis is the same system as Aliens, which we're going to play. We're going to play in a few weeks.
Right, just like minus the religious aspect.
And it adds stress instead of darkness points. So
Got it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I had that little kind of revelation. I wrote the article about Alien Earth, just thinking about like how, because I saw so many people online complaining about, well, for one thing, people just love to complain online. That's just as a general rule. But, like where it was like, there's
They're complaining about children characters acting like children,
or children characters acting like children, or people being stupid. And like, well, like first off, people being stupid is a tried and true part of the Alien franchise. but like, there's a reason for it. And I was thinking about that. And it's like a lot of times people aren't stupid. It's from our perspective pulled back. They're stupid. Look, there's an alien in there. What are you doing? But like they're being pressured.
Yeah, exactly. You don't even have a series. You have the first 20 minutes of the first movie of like, oh shit, I'm not going down there. Hell with that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Wasn't it Eddie Murphy who was like, if it had been a black family going into the Amityville Horror, it'd be like, get out. It'd be like, all right, let's go.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And like a lot of it's like is either corporations pressuring people into these situations or using the androids to, do nefarious things for the corporations that, and a lot of times people are in these circumstances where in the close range of their obvious decisions, it's like this isn't a dumb choice, this is a smart choice, but in the context of what's actually happening in the big picture, it's a really bad choice. And it seems like the system, I haven't played Alien yet, so I want to see if this plays out that way with the RP. But it seems like the system itself would kind of lean into that pretty well, where it's like, you're kind of being pushed towards like those bad decisions, right?
Yeah.
Well, I also like how the series basically writes that into why nobody knows anything about what happened in the past. You know what I mean? Like that's kind of the retcon for Alien Earth is like, wait a minute, aliens were already on Earth. I thought the whole point of like,
but like, why would the CEO tell people, right?
The subsequent movies in the timeline was like, let's not get them there. But it's like, well, yeah, but the corporations are pretty evil, so they knew all along that, what they were and what was going on. It's just, the audience and, the protagonists had no idea and they were the dupes,
Right.
Well, and if you think about it, like look at the technology level, the Alien franchise really changes how science fiction and computers interact with each other, because a lot of science fiction, if we look at now, like you could see that this is a woefully divergent path that humanity has gone on, because Mother and the computer systems that they use are so crazy limited. Do you know what I mean? Like androids are really high tech, and androids can kind of, and cyborgs. Now we know cyborgs.
But they're kind of biological in a weird way. Not weird way, but like it's like they're more like synths. When Blade Runner, they have that more biological quality, and you get to see them from the inside in some of the movies. We get that.
Well, it's almost like the biological quality is the more basic, right? Like, because that's what was developed first. Was sort of biological recreations, and then as you got more technologically advanced, then the simulated humans became a little bit better at what they did, but they also became more technologically advanced and less biological. I think that's kind of interesting because it's a little counterintuitive than what you might expect right now.
But what I was sort of getting at is the idea of like when you said, Sean, like people don't really know about aliens, like it doesn't seem like information is as accessible, right? Like if we're on a ship in Star Trek, for God's sake, like, that's an extreme. You can, it has this like exhaustive database, right? That every ship has access to. And if not, it goes through warp the information, right?
Right. Yeah, you can communicate anywhere.
Where this was like, so somebody has to go into a tiny little room and type on an analog fucking computer on his keyboard and be like, Mother, what's fuck's going on? I don't know. Like,
also,
all right.
It's also an authoritative figure too, because I think that's something that I like to think through in terms of science fiction. Is like you've got the droids in Star Wars, which are arguably, I would say, background characters, but in a sense that they're there to support the human characters in a technical way by translating languages and interfacing with the computer systems and things like that. But the droids are certainly not controlling the people in any sense. But then you have the Mother and you've got Hal and you've got the aggregate. Like where there's a computer system that's really ultimately responsible for the well-being of all of the biological humans in the setting, and just, to one extent or another. And, and then it's easy then for us to assume, based off of Hal and based off of Mother, that that's an evil thing. So when we got to the aggregate, it was like, you know what? That's evil too. I don't care what you say.
I don't care what you said.
I don't have to worry about dying or food or anything, and I can just go off and flit around and be an artist. But God damn it, no, it's controlling me.
Yeah, it's with free market.
It's limiting what I can do.
With free market.
It's I mean, that's something. I mean, I think it may have something to do with the people I tend to play with and myself. But it is funny to me, like a lot of times where I've played or run or like try, like things that are trying to lean more utopian, it tends to it curves back around on itself and it becomes dystopian somehow. So it wasn't just that game. It's something that happens a lot. And we were talking about this, I think, online a little bit, like Star Trek seems to be struggling with that in the context of sort of our modern lives, because it becomes harder for us to believe in the utopian vision of the 60s and 70s.
That is my biggest
90s.
problem with Star Trek, is like, I just don't buy it, right? I don't buy.
Yeah.
It's like one of the big differences, like when I saw the departure to between Star Trek and Babylon 5. And like there was a point in time where one of the characters, because of their association with certain people, wasn't insurable. And this was like an actual problem that they had to deal with. Like, fuck, what am I going to do? And I was like, all right, now that I believe, right? Yeah. Where you would never have that in Star Trek. You know what I mean? Like, they try to get dark and dirty with like Section 51 and stuff like that. But by and large, it is this sort of utopia, where it's hard for me to see human beings getting there, especially nowadays.
Right. Or when they kind of lean against it, like they lean against it sometimes. I mean, like Strange New World has been doing that in the recent season and stuff. And it's like when they lean against it, then it starts not feeling like Star Trek. So it's that kind of that tension of like, the more they want to try to ground it and it being gritty. I mean, I kind of like DS9. Maybe it's also just my age and when I watched it or whatever, but like, because it managed to do this thing where it became more gritty. Like, it did manage to be a little bit more gritty than regular Star Trek. I mean, as much as they were allowed to at the time. But like, it has this sort of cartoony, comic, kind of funny quality to it that like makes it kind of, I don't know, it kind of blunts the grittiness a little bit and makes it, it's like, it's a plucky terrorist and
like literal war stories. You know what I mean? Right, exactly. Yeah. Terrorism, war stories, fucking religious wars. Like
but they're also like all on a mall. They like hang out in the mall and they're just drinking Rockaginos. It's cool.
But it's an important story element. It's an important setting element. You know what I mean? And we felt that in Free Market. And you certainly feel it in the storytelling. It cuts off certain plot lines that you would see in a Babylon 5 that you wouldn't see in Star Trek.
Yeah, definitely.
And so it just sort of like eliminates that from contention for the other aspects of the story. Like, people don't have to worry about, getting food and farming resources and things like that. And so now we can get on to the other elements now that we've established that we have, that we've got no lack of, resources and things that we need. Our bare essentials, what I mean? So I appreciate it from that standpoint. I think you're right. That's why Star Trek starts to fall off in like, when you start getting into those things, it's like, oh, wait a minute, it doesn't feel like Star Trek anymore, because now it's like a survival science fiction. Like, that's not what I'm expecting to see. But I think it, when we get back to talking about the stories and creating some of these worlds and where we might have gone wrong with Free Market and that was really the interesting thing about it was the fact that, it was like, oh, wait a minute, like, just killing somebody is not what it really means in any other setting. And so it changes the plot lines. It changes the, the interactions with the NPCs. It's like, ooh, wait a minute, I accidentally killed you, or maybe didn't. Who cares? You know what I mean? Like,
it can be like, until you do the reframe, it can be a little bit of struggle of trying to find your motivation when you're used to finding motivation in conflict, especially, where it's like, and there still can obviously be conflict in that setting a lot, but it's this, conflict that comes from gift giving. It's a very different kind of thing.
And I think that was the point, right? The point was to think about RPGs a little bit differently, which is one of the reasons I love it and why I absolutely had to include it in that series. Is it makes you think about RPGs differently. It makes you think of it. Normally, the GM is trying to stop somebody from giving something to you, where the setting is literally saying, no, it's not necessarily bad that they're giving something to you, but there's an ulterior motive and they want to give you everything that you ask for.
But also going back to, I didn't get a chance to talk about this when we talked about fantasies, but what do you guys think about the hero fantasy, the epic fantasy? Like, is that really, and maybe it's just because of my very limited, exposure to science fiction RPGs, but like, one of the things I definitely try and incorporate into my D&D and high fantasy stuff is that this is an epic hero fantasy. And so, you're not scrounging for this or that, and certainly you can do that. But I try and lean towards, okay, you guys as characters, your arc is going towards, you're going to be renowned across the land. And that's going to happen in, it's a matter of course. But in science fiction, it's like, that's not even an expectation. Like that's not even a reality that's going to set in at all. And so you're not dealing with the hero science fiction.
Although Star Wars was based on the heroic cycle of Joseph Campbell, so there is that side of it. Joseph Campbell's like,
Luke was definitely the everyman.
Yeah.
Well, and if you think about The Expanse also, like Holden really becomes a folk hero. You know what I mean? Like he gains like so much clout and like political power they become these 5 random people, really. What, 4 random people? 5 with the cop become these, become this thing, right? Like they gain political power in their own right to start making decisions. And I think that's sort of the same thing you're talking about. Like that Holden's journey really is an everyman hero kind of thing. You start like on this. And same thing with Amos, right? Amos was like basically a thug. And now part of his storyline is about how does he cope.
Yeah. I mean, it's about family. Ironically, it's really a story about family as far as that goes. Although with Holden, I think part of the joke is how annoying would this sort of paladin sort of character be? Someone who like always wants to go live with every story, has to do the right thing. I mean, at least originally. Yeah.
Would you be able to do that in game? Like is that?
Well, I think so. I mean, based on The Expanse was an RPG, so I'm guessing. I mean, of course, I'm sure they adapted a great deal and changed a lot. But I mean, I think that setup of having like this group come together, this group of outsiders, group of people who are down their luck. Maybe they have great capabilities of some sort, but they got some issues. They come together, they become a team, and then they find both more capacity together, but also some sort of sense of family. I think that's like one of the very common sort of tropes of space sci-fi, especially where you have like a Corvette sort of class ship where everyone is living on the ship, and kind of like the ship becomes your rock band, or whatever it is,
And Sean, you're bringing something up that made me think about like scale, right? I think we think about fantasy more often than not in terms of a little bit more of a terrestrial scale. And then like, of course, we all started our gaming group together with this multi-dimensional jaunt and
kind of Planescape-esque,
very genre warping, in a lot of different ways. But you could think about it is kind of fun to think about the idea of like think about how limited in scope Star Wars is, right? Like,
I meant the original film.
this is the first time Luke gets off of the planet, right? And he's sort of thrust into this whole thing, but they only really go to one or two planets. They don't, you know what I mean? They eventually go to the Death Star. It would be just like a fantasy character. They start in their one little village. They've never left their village. They go to the big city. You know what I mean? They have to go to the giant fortress of the evil bad guy, and destroy it. It's actually, if you think about it, remember Krull, right? It's ostensibly the same, right? Very similar concept to Krull, where Krull had the big citadel that would move, right? They had to figure out where the bad guy's citadel was going to appear each day, kind of idea. Similarly, thinking about those same arcs, and one is clearly fantasy, although Krull did have some science fiction elements to it. It could too clearly science fiction, which had some fantasy elements to it. It's just kind of interesting.
Yeah, and I'll point out that Han and Luke got the medals in the end, right? Like they got they received the medals in the end, so they were the heroes. Even though Chewbacca stood there, he didn't get a medal. He just stood on the stairs. Neither did the droids.
And then thinking about like reputation, I think that has to be part of a game. And I think if it's not part of a game, then it's not part of your setting, right? Like, and it's interesting too because there's not that in D&D. And like, how do D&D groups deal with that?
It gets hand waved in some of the versions in some ways, but it's never really like part of the core system at all. Yeah.
No, it has to be written in.
Maybe it's just me. I've certainly read it in, but I also think it's more core to the system. But if you're thinking about our science fiction settings, which one of those would be conducive to if we had continued on? That our characters could ultimately have become heroes. I think it would have been fairly limited. Like just right off the bat, I would say not Coriolis, Mothership, CBR plus Punk, Echoes.
Well, what I would say is that we would probably, I mean, it can just happen spontaneously, but I think if we wanted to play one of those games with that concept in mind, we could very easily do it, especially with a couple more players, especially doing the kind of group of
Mothership. I wouldn't think so. Like Mothership, I would think, that has a limited scope to it. Cyber plus Punk, I mean, we've all played 2077, I think, right? Did you play, Sean, 2077? Yep. We've all played 2077. We know that Cyberpunk has pretty significant reputation things in there, right? But like Twilight Imperium is probably closest to that because Twilight Imperium has a very clear, first off, it is a very clear political scope, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Front and center is a Senate. Right, much like
you're already tied to
a galactic Senate. You're already tied to a very large political body. Now you're doing like good guy stuff for that large political body, kind of idea.
I very much felt like you're kind of the Jedi of that world.
Yeah. That's how I felt like it was. I felt like it was certainly, Yeah, I agree. I think Twilight Imperium probably was the most likely. Although, if you really think about it, free market is all about the hero's journey.
Getting to that point. And we certainly had that in mind at the start. I think free market was conducive to that.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is also because we're playing all these sort of like partial one-shots to kind of get a sense of the system. And, a lot of times for the first time, if we're going to play a campaign in something, I think that would also affect the kind of stories that we can tell, and especially we're intending to tell that sort of story or explore that kind of story because we're not really telling it exactly. But
it'd be something interesting to look out for. I know we already did the first D&D session, and if you look at that, like I think there is that sort of like preamble to the heroes coming into the story. We'll see what the other fantasy and D&D sessions go to, but it's just something to keep an eye out for. I think that's interesting because that also builds interest in your character, in your PCs. Or in your players to say, hey, here's where we could be going with this.
And I will say some genres just defy the idea of heroes, right? Like some genres you could argue that maybe they become reluctant heroes or whatever the case is. Certainly Hero from Snow Crash is a good example of that.
Sure.
But some of those genres, particularly dystopian and horror, or spies, right? Unless you're James Bond, you're trying to avoid
usually to be a hero in those you have to die. I mean, that's not always, but usually that's like part of it. It's like if you really want to like sacrifice and have that sort of thing, then you got to go out in the last act.
Yeah. So we did Coriolis, we did Mothership, which is two types of horror in space, which is kind of funny. Then we went into Cyber plus Punk, and then the extension to that, which was Echoes of the Veil, and where Rafi joined us, and that was pretty cool. And that was probably our biggest genre shift, right? Where the first two were pretty similar genres. Right. In fact, they were the exact same setting, just different systems. The second two were the same system and slightly different genres within cyberpunk.
Plus Punk, the Mind the Gap, we really didn't know what we were getting into. That wasn't apparent until the end what genre we were in, and the fact that we were in a simulation. Yeah.
Right.
And who knows where that would have gone afterwards, because we really never even saw the real world.
Well, I was dying of cancer, so that was the end for me. I was the hero.
But those were the biggest like divergence from science fiction, right? So if you see cyberpunk as a subgenre, and because quite honestly, we could do an entire series on cyberpunk, which I'd like to do down the line. It also, if you think about it, all the other games were in space, and like, this is what I'm trying to say, like between fantasy and science, like other than some very specific settings like Spelljammer and Planescape and so on and so forth, a lot of times fantasy does tend to be a lot more terrestrial, right? Where science fiction has a little bit broader scope, I think. I think when we think science fiction, we tend to think space, but there's so, like we were talking about Trinity within it, just Aeon alone had so many possible subgenres you could play in, that were all science fiction, but it would be kind of funny that you could very easily go from post-apocalyptic hanging out in FSA or hanging out in France and then hop on a spaceship and do space opera.
The funny thing about space as a setting also is, I mean, space, of course, is huge. It's the one thing we all know about it. But usually when you're in space, you're usually in a confined space. So it's like expansive in terms of the distance between different places, but you're also usually in like on a floating island of one sort or another, which does affect the kind of stories you can and can't tell, or how how the stories unfold.
I also feel like environment is, I don't know, kind of more of a thing. Like, it's more common for your environments to be trying to kill you, in science fiction.
And much more, because you're right, because in fantasy, it's to some extent it's somewhat limited because you're dealing with weather, you're dealing with, depending on it. I think you're going to see kind of the similar things over and over again. But yeah, in science fiction, like the setting could be absolutely brutal, and the environment and the survival aspect of it could be so much more severe, and certainly something totally original.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have this relatively compelling survival game of just like, okay, where we have to get from one ship in spacesuits across some void to another ship. Go. And like the tension and everything is just like trying to figure out, like, if we veer off course just a little bit, we're kind of fucked. I'm not certain if I like that scene in Star Trek. I think it was the first reboot with Chris Pine, and they're like shot from one vessel through like a debris field, and
That's with
like
Khan. That was the second one.
Khan? Yeah, it was Khan. I think it was Khan.
Yeah, it was Khan.
Was
it
it
was him
Khan?
and
Okay.
Yeah.
And it was like AI really helped them, which was kind of funny. Like, like their little jetpacks and such really helped them. And like what happens when it shuts down. But, you knew that they were going to succeed because it's fucking Star Trek, right? But it still had a fair amount of gravitas. But once
there's a
like,
falling scene in the first one where the red shirt got it too. That was good.
Oh my God, with the drill, right? And you're just like, holy.
Yeah. The first one, the three of them go out, and you're like, well, the one guy's dead. That's happening.
Done, right? Like, is in this version of Star Trek, does Sulu bite it? So Cyber plus Punk and Echoes were like an interesting divergence, right? Like, it feels so different, even though it's science fiction. But the other 5 were different games and felt differently, but we were all in space, right? And it's like different ways to manage space. Free Market was probably the least spacey, even though you guys made it more about space. Like
we had a goal to get out to space,
right,
and
to get out off the station.
We never got there. Yeah, we never actually got there.
Right. Trinity and Twilight Imperium were probably the most stereotypical space opera. Trinity's like a little bit more like soft science fiction than space opera, I think. But I don't know. What do we think? Like, because RPGs tend to be so character driven, I think the difference between space opera and soft science fiction is like inward facing compared to outward facing.
Yeah.
Where like, soft science fiction is sort of like we're going out into the world and doing things where like that's why Farscape, right, was like a little bit more space opera, because it was really just about their relationships. Like, yes, shit happened outside the craft and they went to different planets and all that, happy horse shit. But by and large, it was just about their relationships, and the relationships, like the fact that the bad guy ultimately becomes a crew member and main part of the show,
Right.
as like, is he an antagonist or not? And other members sort of come in and out of that role as well throughout time, makes it like pure space opera, right? Like Star Wars is pure space opera. It's about their relationships, the big reveal of like who's father, that was like so meaningful. It almost didn't matter what everybody was doing.
It's not a spoiler anymore.
I know people who have not seen Star Wars, and it's like, how on earth have you not seen Star Wars? Is there anything about the genres, about the games that we played?
There's just one thing I wanted to mention. So you're talking about Coriolis and having a hard time kind of latching on to the setting at first until you kind of got it, and then it locked in and you got it, right? Like for me, because at first I didn't know anything about the setting either, and I hadn't played the system before. But as soon as I had like Dune, I was like, okay. That was the reference point that I kind of pulled off of. And I think we've talked about this before on the podcast, so I won't get into too much detail. But like a lot of times it does wind up being like a movie or a book or whatever it is. It becomes a through line that, the ideal isn't to like just replicate what happens in the book, unless you're even if you're trying to play like, in that setting. I don't know, without those points, a lot of times I feel like I would be completely lost with a lot of these things. So it's always good. A lot of times when I want to learn a system, a lot of times I'll watch a movie or read a book before I even look at the system book,
It informs the aesthetic, but it also informs, I think, the
choices
relationships between the body politic, or, the different groups and factions that might be there. So I think and you're right. I think that does kind of start to hit home once you identify with, some of those other IPs that you're familiar with,
and the assumptions that you can make about the world with, like, do I have a comm in my head that I can talk to people across the station, or do I have to go in person?
Right. I've always struggled in developing settings and developing games. Always struggled with like, how many layers do I have to worry about? Fantasy, I feel like I have to worry about fewer layers. I feel like I'm worried about like little interpersonal layers, and then I'm worried about a sort of a magical layer. Other than that, I'm not really worried beyond that. It doesn't mean that I don't know what maybe the geopolitical shit's going on, but I'm not I don't have to focus on that. And a player's ability to find out anything beyond them usually ends up being pretty limited, right?
Yeah.
Where science fiction, right from the get-go, you have so many layers. You have to think about media. You have to think about like technology levels. You have to think about like what kind of information do they have access to? Like, think about how many times we've wound up in a fucking like rabbit hole doing research online. And could you imagine that end up being a game? You know, I mean, like, okay, let's learn everything we can about X. You know, this is what we're gonna do.
Yeah, we usually we do that during downtime, but
right, absolutely. But I mean, like, that's why you have to have limitations to downtime. I feel like to some degree, right? Unless you're in a city setting, you might have a little more access to things, but you have to have it has to be a resource, right?
Yeah,
because if it's not like fantasy, you're just like, all right, I read a book. Like that, I read a book, I talk to a couple people. There's where all my information's coming
talk
from.
to a bird.
I talk to a bird. Maybe I can like, you know, augur or divination or something like that. Your ability to do that stuff ends up being pretty limited, you know, but like in science fiction settings, they can really be wide open. And I think that can be really daunting for a lot of GMs. I think that's actually storytelling wise what Foundation was doing really well. And that it started very small. It just started with the main character. I forget her name. I apologize. The main character, the girl prodigy, is in her little village and she has to deal with this sort of religious issue. And you're like, well, where's she going? What's happening? And then she goes off planet and her world gets bigger. You know, it's the same thing with Luke, right? Luke starts on his little planet. He's in Tatooine. He's never seen anything or known anything else. You're dealing with, you know, very terrestrial shit. And you don't, you know, it's interesting in Star Wars, you're not really as worried about communications. You're not really, you know, but you do have to, once you get things going, you have to be worried about like, okay, how easy is it to communicate in space? You know, how much information can they get? How much are they interacting with? Like, it's so easy to like monoculture entire planets, right? But it's like, if you think about all the cultures on our planet and then your head starts fucking spinning when you're like, wait a minute, they're going to go to other planets.
I mean,
You know?
that's why Star Trek, it was always that way, you know, especially the early, you know, TOS, it was like, this is the planet of this thing, you know, because you can't,
and if it wasn't, it was because these two races were at war.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Well, yeah, exactly.
The point you made was a really good one. Like, you weren't there for the first season of Witch Hunters, but it was remarkable. I mean, I expected it to a certain degree, but it was even more than I expected. How much the campaign changed between when it was an overland travel campaign, when they were basically trying to get from like this village that burned to the city far in the north, you know, and that was like 20 sessions of that. You know, it was very different campaign. You're the same characters, then getting into a city and kind of like, now we're in a city with these giant libraries and with all these sort of, you know, like knowledgeable people that have contacts of their own. And, you know, it really changed the dynamic a lot.
It's one of the things that I really love about Ars Magica, and I talk about it constantly, and it's things that I try to hearken back to is this idea of like, adventuring is a distraction to what we all want to be doing. It's like we all want to be home and safe and doing important, interesting things in a world where magic exists, where we have political realities, where we have to worry about our fucking crops. Like, these are the shit we want to do, but those fucking orcs, and and it's something that I seek in a lot of games to play that off of each other. And like Jamie, you and I talk about like how reluctant hero arcs don't happen often, but I think that's really where it comes from.
They're hard to make it work.
Yeah, it's to say it's same thing with like downtime in Blades and a lot of games that we do now. It's like, okay, I want to stay in downtime. Like I want, there's all this information I want to get. There's all these things I want to do, but all right, fine. I go have to make money, or I have to go find some sword, or, or I have somebody's asking for help, whatever, and I don't.
Yeah, someone's trying to kill me. Yeah.
Somebody's trying to fucking kill me. Like, all right, fine. I have to not do that thing that I've been doing. And I like to try to hit on that a lot more in my games as much as I can,
Yeah. I mean, for whatever reason, the first thing I thought of was The Wire, and one of the things about The Wire I loved was like right off the bat, like it feels different than most procedural cop stories. Oh, because the cops don't want to do any of this stuff. Like most of this, one or two of them kind of have this sort of like kind of mental issue where they like actually can't put the case down kind of thing, but it's played off almost more like a mental illness than like like anything else. Like everyone else, it's like kind of like, I don't want to do that. Like, oh, you take these bodies. Like, I want to eat Cheetos over here. Fuck off.
Right. It's the same thing with fucking Slow Horses, right?
Yeah, totally. I love that show.
It's a bunch of misfits. We don't want to engage with all the, like, we don't, it's interesting as you say that, like, police, this is not meant to be disparaging or political, but the reality is like, I've seen so many police, like, if some cops get into that job and they're like, I want to do good. I want to, like, solve crimes. I want to, like, stop bad guys. It's so easy to get jaded because, like, same thing with social work, right? The exact same thing with social work. Like, the more you engage with, like, the grime and the corruption and other lazy motherfuckers and so on and so forth, the less you start wanting to do that, or you leave, like
you burn
so
out.
It just like really perpetuates this idea of like, I don't want to do the adventuring shit, right? That would be a really funny mechanic to have in a game, is burnout.
You were talking about Slow Horses and like these we've been talking about these group stories, and like I've been thinking a lot lately about how much it works better. At least to me, is more interesting story, more interesting to play when you're like a group playing in like a group of fuck ups. So each of you have like this sort of skill. You have this thing that you are really good at, and when you're part of the team, you can be good at that. But for the most part, you're kind of a fuck up. Versus like all of us are Jason Bourne. We're the super agents. Like, I love playing that stuff when I was 14, but I got to that point where it's like, that's not as interesting. I mean, sometimes you want to do that, but for the most part, that's not where it's interesting. It's where your character is. I mean, maybe they don't want to do the thing, but a lot of times it's also like they can't do the thing, like any other normal person. And so that's why they're a spy.
Or flawed, or tragic. Their ending is tragic. And, we've played a couple of those as well, where it's a pretty it's still a satisfying ending because it's dramatic, and to some extent the way that we've been able to play these shorter versions of the settings. When it comes to that, it's like you're not releasing days, weeks, and months and years of character development and things like that. But I think there's also that aspect of some of the things we've done.
Yeah, definitely. Not the stuff we've recorded for the show, but definitely that's my usual style, as we've jokingly discussed many times. 400 sessions, and
I mean, it's like whenever you, even in my youth, when my friends used to joke that making characters with me was like rev up the wheelchairs. Like I either my characters or I would push my players' characters to just pile on flaws and like disadvantages. Like one of the formative games for me was Hero, and you got super powerful by having a shit ton of disadvantages. Like Superman is as powerful, like speaking in mechanical terms, Superman is as powerful as he is because how deadly kryptonite is to him, how crippling Lois Lane is as a dependent NPC, you know, and like that kind of stuff. And that was far more interesting to me than like D&D stories, where quite honestly, mechanically, there's no way to do that. There was no piece of the equation where my D&D character was flawed other than him being a first level character.
Yeah, or having low scores. Yeah.
Or adding it in, and, patching as we do with D&D.
As we do with D&D, but I think a lot of people, that's a piece that maybe one of these games we can kind of focus on is how is that acting differently when you have mechanics. Burning Wheel is going to be the perfect example, which is our first fantasy game, but thinking about, old World of Darkness games, right? Where you had edges and flaws. And then of course, like we said with Hero, you have like disadvantages. And I think when games start with that sort of stuff, I think it really gives the GM like pushback points, right? Mm-hmm. Areas that allow the story to be more than just about how do I get to level 20, which I think a lot of people are stuck on. I'm sure there's plenty of groups that are like happy with playing their little dramas, right? And inter-character conflicts and so on and so forth. I'm not saying that's not the case, but
rewards you get from progression and things like that.
Yeah.
One of the things we haven't touched on yet that was new for me with these settings was between sessions. There's character evolution, and it's not experience points, and it's not level upping. It's either augmenting the technology or losing the technology that you started with, or like free market with the memories, right? Was that the one where we had short-term, long-term memories, and then that played a part in really what the next session was going to be about, I imagine, and story development as well. So I think that those in between rewards that you get, and they're not always rewards, it's probably the wrong term, I think that was a unique way of putting the characters together and avoiding that I just need to start collecting a whole bunch of stuff, and I need to start, increasing my numbers, so that I'm better, what I mean? That kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely thought of this a lot, about like how character development, while character development can happen in D&D, either through just kind of imposed or, sort of character arcs, but also like through like developing powers do change what you can do in the world. It does change certain things. It is a certain type of development, but it's very different from like character development in most movies, for instance, where like you do have sometimes where like, from scene one to the like final scene, they have this sort of increase in their capabilities, but the story isn't about that. Right. Usually it's that's usually the mechanism by which they can, the stakes can be raised around them, like where it's like your character becomes quote unquote more powerful, so you can raise the stakes and have them be involved in, a world level event, Avengers event or whatever.
Yeah, it's the it's the item that this MacGuffin that moves you forward with that.
But even then, it's still something that like on its own doesn't feel as usually as rewarding to me as when I like have a sense of what the character kind of like where their endpoint is, or where they're like kind of where their goals are. And even if it's going off of where they are, like instead of protecting my character, a lot of times it'll drive me to want to push the character in the other direction. I mean, the one we were joking about earlier about me choosing to have my character have cancer. And of course that's easier to do as a throwaway in a one, like a one session thing. But it's definitely been a reframe for me when I can start thinking about characters in RPGs a little bit more like I think about them when I'm writing a book. Although I'm not George R.R. Martin, quite where it's like I want to kill everyone, but like it definitely changes your frame
in the worst
a bit.
ways.
Yeah, it can be a limiting factor sometimes to like want to protect your character too much in a game. We talked about turtling a bunch in other sessions. So, but anyway, I'm getting off of sci-fi a bit, so we circle back to that before.
Cool. Let's talk a little bit about games we didn't play. I think this was easier in our horror wrap-up because we had sort of seminal horror games that we had not touched on that were, I think, pretty important to mention. And I had actually done a video that sort of covered, hey, here's what these games are about. Here's the history of them, where they fall into place, right? I think science fiction tends to be much, much harder because there is this exhaustive list of games we did not play. Sean, you had started out with like the big ones we did not play.
Well, and I think those IPs or those those familiar stories like Star Trek, Star Wars. I'm sure if we had started off with those, it would have been a bit of a disservice to me coming into this, just to try and embed myself into a new system, a new way of playing, and then also and comparing that to the high fantasy that I played in the past. I would come with a set of expectations. When you're talking about Star Trek, Star Wars, Expanse, Babylon 5, anything that's already, either had Dune, I don't even know if that's an RPG, but
I'm sure it is. Yeah.
I'm sure it is. Just like it's a video game, but you come to that with a pretty good sense of what the world is and what the characters are, and
right. And drawing on those things and trying to play in that world are two different things too, a bit, where you're drawing on Dune for Coriolis, but it's not the same as trying to play in Dune, right?
Right. But I would say for me, and for anybody that would be new to it, the focus would be on the system, right? Would be on, okay, how do I do something in this world? You'd rolling dice or with cards, that I'm not really familiar with, but everything else I'm familiar with. Whereas I came to this not familiar with either. You know what I mean? So I'm learning the system and the setting at the same time. And, like when we did Mothership, it was like the characters didn't know anything. Me as a player didn't know anything. I didn't know how to do anything. I didn't know how to use my armor.
The ship is trying to kill you.
Just absolutely like starting from scratch. Whereas, those other systems and those other IPs, if that's where you're starting at, then, and great, and certainly I'm a fan of all of them and would love to like develop a character in that setting. But I thought it was much more impactful to start off with something that I wasn't familiar with from a setting perspective.
We've been having a lot of fun, and I think what we're doing is more entertaining. Of course, our limited audience, probably 4 people at this point.
It's about 200 subscribers.
Feel free to chime in on the Discord. But if we were approaching this in a cynical or a clinical way, not a cynical way, a clinical way, we would have had one setting, right? That we would have established and then played all of the different games. There's actually an old Forge game designer, Clinton R. Nixon. I think I'm pretty certain he was the one who pointed out that a game's efficacy was measured by how well it did Star Wars, right? So very often we would have hacks for each of these games that like, can you play Star Wars with this? How would you do that? Kind of idea.
Really? That was his measuring stick? That's awesome.
Yeah. So the Expanse, Star Wars, Star Trek, Babylon 5, Farscape, Dune. I can't think of any, but I know there are. They all have RPGs. I've definitely wanted to play Dune. I've played a ton of Babylon 5. There's been so many versions of Star Wars and Star Trek. The first, all right, here we go. Here's a little trivia question for you guys.
Oh boy.
What was the first franchise RPG, science fiction franchise RPG on the market?
Travelers.
Well, Traveler wasn't an IP.
Oh, IP. Okay.
I'm saying amongst these, a franchise that existed at the time. What do you think?
StarCraft.
No. So Star Trek, a company called FASA, and FASA were the people who had originally done Shadowrun. But before they did Shadowrun, they actually did Star Trek.
I didn't know that. That's cool. I know FASA.
Yeah, and then it was like a box set for Star Trek. Star Wars did not come until later on. West End Games created a game called, it was Star Wars, but it used the D6 system. It was actually a really, really good die pool system that they used for all of their in-house games like DC Heroes and a couple others. But Star Trek actually came before all of the others.
I just want to point out that was probably due to Roddenberry being, having the foresight that George Lucas did not have, in allowing somebody to implement a game system in that.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things going on there in terms of what was the difference between like Paramount and whoever owned Star Wars at the time, which I think was just solely Lucas. And I think it was much harder.
I mean, Lucas had full control until he gave it to Disney. Yeah.
Right. But yeah, so let's see here. Things Starfinder, we did not play. There's a number of apocalyptic games, right? If again, apocalyptic games, I think are like a larger subgenre, but we didn't play Apocalypse World, but we played a lot of Apocalypse Engine kind of stuff. We didn't play Gamma World, big one. Right? Gamma World, Star Frontiers. These are all like hardcore old school. Probably one of the oldest games on this list we didn't play. There was a game called Universe that we didn't play, and Space Opera. Both of them very, very old school science fiction games.
The game was called Space Opera?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's called Space Opera. I thought we were just blending our genres.
So that was Fantasy Unlimited. You probably would know Fantasy Unlimited most likely from Villains and Vigilantes. That was probably their most popular game. But they did a whole slew of games. They did a game called Super World, Psy World, Swordbearer, and one or two others, including Villains and Vigilantes. And they were all these little box games and these little like simple staple-bound books. They actually did a lot of really interesting things that we did not really get to go. They're also harder to get in PDF nowadays than I think. Sure. Villains and Vigilantes you could definitely get, but you really have to dig, and maybe luckily the company doesn't exist anymore, but now with social media, I'm pretty certain you can probably reach out to some of those game designers and do that. Let's see here. We didn't play Stars Without Numbers, Eclipse Phase. There's a game called Hot War or Cold City. It's two different games that recently, about just a couple months ago, actually had a re-release. Those are interesting. I don't know when we're going to play Mountain Witch, but we definitely have to play Mountain Witch. And those had a similar mechanic off of Mountain Witch. So it's like precursors or like, descendants of story games, as we go. Mountain Witch being one of the earlier story games that were really popular, and then how people use those mechanics. 316 is a game we didn't play. It was definitely on the list of games we wanted to play. It's really interesting. 316 is pretty cool because it's you have two skills war and not war, which is pretty fun. And it's sort of based off of Starship Trooper kind of esque, mentality. When we do our military setting, I think we're going to play 316 because it's very much in scope of like Starship Troopers, where you're like going out and like, hunting aliens. That's your job, is to go out and hunt aliens.
But you have some interesting stories to tell back in training camp and, with your fellow soldiers, potentially. the not war check.
And hey guys, are we the baddies?
In this list, or anything you could think of games that you really wanted to play? I have two.
I mean, we long ago exhausted all the games I've heard of in the genre, so
I mean, any of these.
Starfinder.
Right. Starfinder's interesting because it's like, Starfinder science fiction or is it fantasy? But then again, is using D&D races, species, any different than Star Trek aliens?
Not really. I mean, Vulcans are space elves who worship logic. And
right.
Why are they all humanoids?
Well, they do explain that in TNG, although it's not a very good explanation. But they do try to explain it, where there was like a progenitor race.
Yeah, humanoids were seeded across the galaxy by an original species. I think that's perfectly, that's an explanation. At least, maybe a slightly better explanation than why Dragonborn look like people. It's just the fact that humans have sex with everything.
That is a difference between the two, where it's like you can always, like in sci-fi, there's usually kind of this expectation that you have to, or you should to some extent, explain things, whereas in fantasy, I mean, of course it depends on the style of fantasy you're trying to do, but like with Dragonborn, it's like it was a certain point where it's just like, because it's magic. Like, why are you even asking this? Like, what, because it's cool and it's magic. So,
some wizard and a cleric got together, did some, magic that, is forbidden, probably.
You either go like the OSR route where it's hand waved and, it just happens, or you just find it out in game or whatever the case is, and it just comes off the cuff, or you get the route of people who are like, I think it was the lazy GM. I apologize, I forget his name. He
Flourish, is that right?
Yeah, but I forget his name. But his actual name, but because he's a luminary, and I apologize because I do listen to him a lot. He was like, you had this opportunity, or was it Mike Merles? I forget, but they were talking about how like you had this opportunity with orcs in 2024 to really like dive into their history and what makes them orcs, and blah 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 blah. I'm like, and that's cool. That's you have your opportunities there. I don't think it was, just as an aside, I don't think that was the role of the player's handbook. I think that's what setting material is for. I think they were trying to make it a more generic fantasy book for you to then spin off your own games. And, quite honestly, I think we're going to find out. I think Daggerheart actually did it better in saying here is a general framework by which then you go off. Or I'm sorry, frameworks are not a good word because they use frames for something else. But here is a general rule set by which you then can make your own stuff, which I love. But I agree with you. I think that while there are some people who think that those, like the ecology of the Ramaraz, is really interesting.
Which is fine if that's how you want to go with it, but it's like that. It's not requisite, I don't think.
I love that stuff. I'll be interested to see how Dragonheart shakes out. But I mean, like and you guys know I love the Dragonlance setting, but like any of the D&D settings, like they just go into the mythology of like where elves originated and then how the different elves came about, and where gnomes, dwarves, and halflings and we're
and different accounts of those things, and they change over the editions.
From a mythological perspective, and even among the species that they have their own understanding or appreciation of what that mythology. It can just get so dense.
I mean, it's funny because I say that as someone who loves lore in fantasy, especially like Witch Hunters is a great example.
I love that we have conversations where there's several seminal books in the campaign at this point where you're like, this guy's journal or this, and we've had like cool side conversations, and I love the idea of side conversations in games, like literally sessions where you sit down and be like, by the way, and we do it very informally, but I think there's space to do it formally, like Invisible Sun does, which we'll talk about sometime later. But this idea that you're just like, oh yeah, by the way, let's have this side conversation about this book that you guys read, right? Because that's so hard. And at one point in time, you're like, by the way, this was like a year ago at this point, so you're not going to remember. But
I was surprised some players did remember, but
they do, which is awesome. I love that shit. I think what it is that in fantasy, that stuff's mystery, where in science fiction, you're not leaning on the same kind of idea of mystery, right? Like you have secrets, but those secrets aren't mysterious. That makes sense, right? Like, so it's like if you find a book in a fantasy world, you're like, oh, this is going to reveal some ancient arcane knowledge, right? And this is important because this is really the only place I could get this information, right? Where in science fiction, you're just like, dossier. Yep, here's info dump.
Right.
Here's all of the information you have on this planet.
It's more of like a MacGuffin a lot of times too, where it's like, oh, I got the chip, I got the document, but it's not so much about what the document actually is. It's just the chip. That's the thing.
And think about, again, we put on it. We mentioned it a little earlier about like monocultures and stuff. Think about what you would do to players if you were like, every single planet. I just want you to think of one set of books, and that is the Encyclopedia Britannica. Imagine if you just handed the players the Encyclopedia Britannica for every single planet that they visited. Be like, here you go. This is all the information you have on this planet.
But even that is dated. I want to just bring only because I've just gone through all of my boxed books that are like that I have in my little storage room. I'd like to point out that the older the book in real life, generally, the less useful it really is. Like if you get a fiction, a nonfiction book from the 1960s, and I've found quite a number of them from my dad's collection, my own, and it's been like looking through this, like, man, this information is just totally useless.
Yeah. If you go back enough, it's like, plate tectonics. What are those? And,
like I even have like an animal encyclopedia, and I'm like, do I want to keep an animal encyclopedia from 30 years ago? Like the information is probably not good. Who knows?
Yeah, that's true. It's like usually in a fantasy setting, you like find the 5,000-year-old book, and it's like a big, holy shit!
It's like, oh my god, it's telling you some truth about
like,
the world. Yeah,
like, you open it up, and it's just like the dumbest things you've ever read. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think that's something that doesn't happen in fantasy that happens in science fiction because it happens in a real world. In fantasy, things don't change as much. And in fact, it's, I think what you see, what the books that are old that are useful to us, besides like poetry and stuff, right? Or grocery fucking lists from Roman times. That's what's really most useful to us now is esoterica, is understanding philosophy, understanding how people were thinking, understanding these symbols meant this, and so on and so forth. That ends up being timeless because those ideas change, but you're looking at the forebears of those change are actually useful. Understanding Aristotle is useful to understanding Kant, and so on and so forth, where understanding Darwin is not really terribly useful to understanding biology nowadays. Like,
I mean, it isn't.
vaguely interesting, but it's we think about those things so very differently now. Now, don't get me wrong, like Newton is still seminal work in physics.
Well, and it has a paradigm shift, but to your point, yeah, like actually reading the literal text is not going to give you like, oh wow, I didn't know about that, that about finches. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like you're just going to be like, okay, it was interesting how it came about in that way. Whereas,
Yeah.
like I think, having, that perspective and, no, we're way off of fantasy, but like, one of my favorite things about, the history of ideas and thought is like, wow, just putting yourself in the shoes of those people in like the Enlightenment, where at some point they thought that they were going to soon know everything there is to know about the world
Right.
mathematically and naturalistically, only to, just to have that perspective, I think is really, really cool.
But also, like, we have a different relationship to facts. And I think it's important to understand that a lot of those old books are not really useful. And I'm saying this quite to bring it back to gaming in terms of like thinking about fantasy worlds compared to science fiction worlds. Like, we have a very different relationship to facts. And I think what's really useful to those books is the cultural context. Understanding and reading Roosevelt's like travel guides yes, they were sort of jingoistic, and yes, like it's like a time and place, but it's like understanding where he was and where he was in that culture, and like we probably know more about primates, but like reading Goodall's stuff is probably not like super useful because you could read something more up to date nowadays, but understanding who she was and within the scope of the first understanding of how like primates, existed in those packs. Those are interesting. So it's like, how do you bring that into a game? I think that's kind of an interesting idea.
Yeah.
Like your tomes for witch hunters, Jamie. It would be interesting to be like, oh well, shit. Like Orion figures out that this is wrong. Right?
Mhm.
Like this is
and some of them I do put some intentional things that are like either wrong or contradict other things that have been said because they're different authors who have written them. So I have played with that a little bit. Yeah, but that would be interesting too.
That's hard to do because it like fucks with people's expectations, right? Like, here's a book, this is fact, and it's like, well, how do you play with that without and still hold on to the value of that knowledge, right? Like we look at old books. I look at old books and I go, wow, this is really interesting. Or I'll look at an older edition of a game, like first edition Vampire, right? There's been so many editions of Vampire at this point.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in the journey, not to be too trite about it. Like, I'm not one of those people who's like, yeah, there might be editions I do or don't like, and I do tend to just play whatever the most current one is for support reasons. But by and large, we have this giant fucking library of games that is like, we don't have to play whatever is the current or the hottest or whatever the case is,
And how wrong would it be to play some of those older versions, right? I'm being facetious.
Right. And,
like,
obviously OSR is sort of built on the idea of like the putting Redbox on a fucking pedestal, right? And that's not a bad thing. Like Redbox was really fun, thinking of, bring back that idea of that information or interactions with knowledge or how science fiction and fantasy, bringing that into RPGs and books and things like that. It made me think of that. But so science fiction really like has a very different interaction with information. But it is interesting to think about in terms of like, how do you give them knowledge? And you want there to be some uncertainty there, and normally, quite honestly, I lean into mechanics. I lean into the idea of like, what did you learn? Make a roll.
Yeah.
let's understand what you gain from this. Maybe you get an advantage. Maybe you don't. Maybe you get a piece of information that I hand to you. But was that information like when I handed it to you? How much of it is accurate or not accurate, and how does that matter? But anyway, we got off topic as we are. Just a couple things. First off, I just want to mention I really want to play 5th edition Traveler at some point in time. It's a bear. It's a thick book. It's really interesting. It's a part of gaming history that I think the two of you should really experience. And we'll do it at some point in time. I don't know when. We have a lot of stuff to get through. The other big one that we didn't play is Burning Empires. We're going to play Burning Wheel next, but Burning Wheel and Burning Empires are two very different animals. And you will hear me talk about Burning Empires a lot. It's probably my favorite all-time game. And one of the things that it does is has scene economies, which basically is this understanding that you and the GM actually do have an adversarial relationship, and but everything is out in the open and understood. So for instance, all the players will make characters, and in all the Burning Wheel games, Burning Empires, Burning Wheel, Blossoms Have Fallen, and so on and so forth, you have life paths that you go through. And those life paths are usually so many years of experience. And the idea is that the players in Burning Wheel just kind of agree, we're going to make Everyman. So we're going to be 3 life path characters. We want to be more like adventurers. We're going to make 4 life path characters. We're going to be movers and shakers. We're going to make 5 and 6 life path characters, and those are old motherfuckers if they're humans. So maybe we'll play demi-humans, kind of idea. And it's very wishy-washy. You just make that decision, right, based on what kind of game you want. Burning Empires, the players are making that decision based on how powerful do we want our adversary. Because however many life paths you create, the highest number of life paths the players get, the GM gets 2 life paths more than that for their main adversary. And it's a scene economy. It's like, what scene do I want to have? There's so many scenes. And what scene, when it comes to me, do I want? What do I need out of it? And how do I get it? And then how do I pump up my rolls in previous scenes in order to accomplish what I'm looking for? So as an example, you have to, it has a thing called a technology burner. And so what it means is that you can actually build technology, and it has very interesting, evocative crafting rules, right? That are in game and out of game. But you could basically create it's a whole set of little mini rules that creates technology. But in order to bring that technology into the game, you have to have a scene. It's called a color scene, where you bring it into the fiction first, and then you get the resources to be able to actually build the technology so that you can add that to a role in a big conflict scene.
We did that with flashbacks. I forget which. Then that I thought that was a really cool mechanic. What you're talking about is a little bit different, because I think you got to do it, preemptively. But I just wanted to point out, because being able to develop the technology and having the flashback to decide what that technology was, and then going back and creating like a mini scene around it was really, really enjoyable, I thought. And it's just something unique. It's not something I would have done ever.
And I think Burning Empires taught me a lot about scene building. I think it's a little too much game for most people. No, I mean, when we had our conversation about like structure, structure versus non-structure. It's as far as it goes in structure. Like everything is proceduralized. But it is one of my all-time favorite games. Gamma World is a big one. We didn't touch on. I think is super fun. The apocalyptic version of DCC of Dungeon Crawl Classics and Mutant Crawl Classics. Those are pretty interesting thing. Gamma World is just it again. They've had so many different iterations. Yeah, so there's a bunch of stuff we haven't played. A couple things that I would have loved to have played, but we just don't have the time. And hey, we'll do another sci-fi series down the line. We have no shortage.
What about Spelljammer? I mean, is that is that the D&D setting that you're considering to be sort of borderline or sci-fi adjacent in a sense?
I mean, in the way steampunk is kind of.
But, that was my question. My question was like, is Spelljammer science fiction or is it fantasy?
Yeah. I mean, I think it kind of is, but in that sort of like everything in the kitchen sink style of like certain parts of D&D where it's like kind of like they just pull tropes from everywhere,
Yeah.
Well, it's funny because I like to marry Spelljammer and Planescape, which is absolutely
same.
that. It's the same.
Right.
Yeah. And for us, I would love, and granted, we always want to run something longer, but I'm really chomping at the bit to do a Spelljammer / Planescape, campaign.
Right. And like Planescape makes it like multidimensional, and then which you can do in sci-fi too in a different way. So I could see that.
If you think about it, like Coriolis is ultimately multidimensional, right? Like, you get a sense that you're probably in the same flat space, but like light years away from each other, right? And those portals, where the fuck are those portals going to? Kind of idea. Becomes way more interesting to think about. It's like, oh well, we can kind of map these out, and obviously this creates kind of a system structure. But as far as we know, those planets aren't anywhere near each other. It just so happens that they're just related because they have this network of jump gates, that are tying them together. That's really, it's the same thing. Same thing with Spelljammer, same thing with, as a Philistogian is such a weird idea.
It's based on like 19th century science, right?
I created a game called From Chaos. I used that I ran probably for a good 6 months using Savage Worlds and like really like how to make Spelljammer less D&D in space or in this weird space and more like this science fantasy, or this fantasy fiction, I don't know what the fuck to call that.
What mashup, to use.
Yeah, what mashup. But Spelljammer is an interesting egg because
with magic.
Because the fun thing is I don't know what they did with the new one. You guys might have read it more recently, but the old one had kind of its own sort of faux space rules. Like, yes.
I remember doing some ship combat and stuff for sure. Back in the day.
There's like these bubbles around the ships, and then like how you orient on the ship and how far you could jump from the ship.
And I remember one time, like this is remembering something from like 30 years ago, but like someone jumped off the rigging, and because of the rules, are like you go under the ship and come around the other side, and because he had like really high dexterity, he was able to like do a.
Well, I remember when we played. Yeah, when we played, Ian did that when I was on, when you guys were traveling on a Spelljammer ship.
Yeah, I remember that too. Yeah.
But I didn't really know the old rules, and the new rules hadn't come out yet, so I was just winging it. And I think he was expecting something to happen that I didn't really catch on. He's like, I jump off the edge of the ship, and I'm like, let's be ballsy. What are you doing? Like, I didn't realize that he was expecting to come back around.
Yeah, that's the sort of assumptions I was talking about earlier, like all the little things you don't even think to ask. That's like, oh wait, how does that work in the world? Where you don't want to like go on a digression where you're like spend an hour looking through the rule books and trying to figure out what the lore is on gravity when you're like so far away from the ship or like whatever it is, but in sci-fi it becomes hard to get away from that stuff sometimes.
So the last piece of the puzzle is I like to sort of wrap up with season favorites. We actually I think played a few more games than we had last season. And what do we think? So, Sean, is Coriolis still your favorite of the group we did?
I mean, if I had to choose another one to play, or to continue to play or to continue the campaign, and I remember being really, really attached to the character, and I think I always sort of get attached to the characters that I create. But I think there was the desire to continue to play that character, but certainly the setting, there was a desire to continue to play in that setting. The space opera, Middle Eastern setting. But, that was also the first time I had done those set of rules, with the darkness dice. And, we've played a number of other different systems since then. I would be hard pressed to go back right now and really be able to verbalize, if that matched up with Coriolis, that would be my favorite system
right.
to continue to use. I actually like Mothership to some extent as well. I thought that one was pretty good, although maybe a little bit more challenging. I thought it was an improvement at the time. But if anybody's going back and listening to the podcast, the cyberpunk, CBR plus punk, session that we had, despite the fact that like 90% of it, I was like super frustrated as a player and didn't know where it was going. But I just, the outcome of that and just the way that unfolded is just one for the record books as far as I'm concerned. So yeah. I really love that. But yeah, but if I had to play again, I would definitely do Coriolis. I'm still planning on making some purchases around the hardback copy. And and would want to run that in the future.
Yeah. If we talk about system or talking about like which game we enjoyed more, because I'd probably say of system, I'd probably be Sire plus Punk. I mean, I've talked about this before. The only thing that I with a Cyberpunk game, I oftentimes find myself wanting a little more detail on the tech sometimes than you get. It can be very sort of hand wavy with that. And that's my only kind of like thing that kind of bumped my head against sometimes. But the basic system, I love the economy of it, that it's flexible and yet, it's simple enough to like learn relatively quickly. You can put in a couple of sheets, but at the same time, it's not like some one sheets where it's like the rule is roll D20 and, tell the story about what the die roll is, and that's it. Kind of.
Well,
kind of
the
thing.
laminated card that it comes with too just made that so
helps
much,
a lot.
Yeah.
But Mothership, I would definitely like. Is one I would probably run. Because I'm gonna run something that wasn't a campaign, that was probably more than one session, but a couple sessions kind of thing. I think Mothership would be good for that. Alien too. Like when we get to that, it's like because the system itself does seem to very much lean into like. I don't want to say disposability of characters, but the idea that like you're gonna go for it and your character very well may not make it. It was funny that we actually didn't all die that session, but so yeah, that was a good one.
So what would you marry up then with the setting and session, setting and system?
Probably Coriolis. I really do like the Coriolis system. Setting. The system. It was okay. I felt like it was a little more traditional than the others in some ways. Aside from the darkness points, which is fine. That's just that didn't like kind of like I didn't have any sort of eurekas with the system as much with that. But I really do like the vibe of the setting and feel like you could get into. Something that was very, Dune meets Mass Effect, kind of with it pretty easily.
These are really great games. And I'm looking forward to another sci-fi series where we play different ones. But I think I mentioned a number of times, I would love to do a free market campaign, like of all of the games that we played. I just think free market has so much depth and so much cool stuff that you could do. Like I want to run free market, but I really want to play free market. But like it, as usual, the real problem is who would run it? Like, although you probably could do like a it's a game that's reactive to the players. So I feel like the other two players could push against each player, right?
Yeah.
So,
Right. Or you could have a rotating storyteller pretty easily, or not storyteller, whatever they call it.
Especially with that mechanic of the memories. Like, you even said that at one point, I had that memory of the body, that I didn't know where it came from. And then, we didn't really use that for the second scene that we went into, based off of that. But I do think that there's, it gives you that, I want to say crutch, but it gives you that capability of just sort of feeding off of the memories, the short-term, long-term memories that are developed. And between Jamie and I think, just given the utopia versus dystopia setting, I think either one of us would have a field day with running that based off of that.
I think you could make an amazing campaign, and like, I feel like gamers often talk about chasing, after that 20th level character, kind of deal. But to me, like seeing the transformation of those memories, you know what I mean? And like seeing the transformation of like a gene line and of like, what kind of tech like, I just think some of that stuff is really, really compelling. So cool.
Yeah.
Well,
Awesome.
that is our wrap up of our second season.
Yep.
I'm very excited.
And it's a pretty good intro, really, to the fantasy also, because we, in contrasting with sci-fi, we talked about fantasy a great deal too. So that's where we're
talk about fantasy, and that's our next season. I'm very excited about that. I'm actually much more interested in our previous two genres, but I'm excited to see what we do with fantasy. And we have a number of new GMs that we're gonna bring on board. We're gonna talk to a number of different people like we did last season, which I hope was cool. And I implore anybody who's listening, like, come onto the Discord, check, like, have some conversations. I think that's the only thing that we're really missing is sort of engagement with our community. And apparently, you people are listening to us, but I'd love to, hear some feedback and, your ideas and like where we're going and what we've been doing.
Certainly something we can respond to.
Yeah. And argue with, All right, guys, that's a wrap.
You have been listening to another episode of the Modern Mythology Podcast. We hope we gave you something new to think about that you can bring to your RPGs, writing, and other character-based games and art forms. Produced by James Kershaw. Soundtrack by Scott Landis and James Kershaw. For more information about this episode, articles, or links to our other related projects, visit modernmythology.net.